I'm Kathy Smith, the director of the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society here at Community College of Philadelphia. Today's Perspectives interview is conducted by David Travaskis, who is an adjunct faculty member here and is the pro bono counsel for the Pennsylvania Bar Association. He's also a member of the Center's advisory board. In today's interview, David speaks to Shira Goodman, the executive director of Ceasefire PA. Ms. Goodman is an expert on illegal guns and gun violence and is an advocate through her organization for responsible gun use and laws to ensure safety.
Welcome to the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society's Perspective series on CCP TV, the educational channel of the Community College of Philadelphia. I'm David Travaskis, adjunct professor in the Paralegal Studies program. Today it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Shira Goodman, the executive director of Ceasefire Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show, Shira.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about what Ceasefire PA is?
Ceasefire PA is a coalition of Pennsylvanians, mayors, police chiefs, faith leaders, community organizations across the Commonwealth who together are taking a stand against gun violence. We do that through education, advocacy, programs where we bring people in Philadelphia into the courts to take a stand about gun violence in their communities and to tell judges that people should have serious consequences for bringing illegal guns into our communities. And we do that by trying to change the laws and enacting common sense gun laws to keep us safer.
Okay, now wait a minute. You're the one who's going to be coming into my home and taking away my gun?
No, nobody wants to take away anybody's guns. Our work has always focused on illegal guns, keeping them off the street, and keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. So some people think that there's like a magic ship of illegal guns that brings guns to bad guys in the streets. That's not what happens. Most illegal guns and crime guns started out as being legally purchased, not far from where they are used in crimes, and either they were lost or stolen or improperly transferred through a straw purchase by somebody who could legally buy a gun, who then gave it to somebody who could not legally buy a gun. And so we've been working to crack down on those kinds of things and also to make sure our background check system works and has all the data it needs to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. But law-abiding gun owners really have nothing to fear from the proposals that Ceasefire PA works for and that are on the national and state agendas.
Well, why do you think then that people get so upset?
I think that the NRA lobbyists and officials have done a very good job of showcasing any kind of change as a threat to gun owners, as saying there's a slippery slope that any kind of change in background checks or requirements that you report if your gun gets lost or stolen, very common sense, reasonable thing that even most law-abiding gun owners and most NRA members will tell you they support. They say that there's a slippery slope to registration and confiscation. And they've done a very good job with a lot of money and a lot of people and pressuring politicians and scaring people into believing that. But it's not true. And we know, Quinnipiac poll recently found that 95% of Pennsylvania households, including gun owners, want background checks on all gun sales. So, 95% of people in Pennsylvania don't agree on much, but to agree on that shows it's really common sense. It's not about taking guns away, it's about keeping people safer.
Well, it's so interesting because the first thing we always hear when the issue of illegal guns comes up is the idea that guns are legal and that they're guaranteed to us under our United States Constitution under the Second Amendment. Is that really true?
Well, for a long time there was a debate about what the Second Amendment really meant. Was it about a militia? Was it about an individual right to bear arms? And for a long time, until just a few years ago, that was the debate that we had in this country. A few years ago, our United States Supreme Court, in a case called Heller, involving laws in D.C., said, you know what, there is a Second Amendment personal right to bear arms. And like our other constitutional rights, like the First Amendment, like the Fourth Amendment, it's subject to reasonable regulation. There's no such thing as an absolute constitutional right to anything. I can't come on this show and slander you or libel you. I can practice my religion freely, but not if it involves child sacrifice. So similarly, the Supreme Court was clear that we do have a personal right to bear arms, but that it is subject to reasonable restrictions. And those things have included and can include things like background checks, things like limits on what types of guns can be in the public domain.
And actually, for everyone who's watching this show here in Philadelphia, they're also covered by the Pennsylvania Constitution, which in Article 1, Section 21 is much more explicit about the right to bear arms.
It says the right to bear arms shall not be questioned. So the difference is the words shall not be infringed and shall not be questioned. I still believe that that means that there can be limits. We've always had background checks in Pennsylvania, and in fact, Pennsylvania has more background checks than some other states. Here, we require that every sale by a federally licensed dealer goes through a background check, and every handgun sale, even if I sell you a handgun, we are supposed to go to a dealer and get a background check. The loophole in Pennsylvania is if I want to sell you, somebody who's not related closely to me, a long gun, a rifle. Some people call them modern sporting rifles. Other people call them semi-automatic assault weapons. That's not covered. And that's something that is being proposed both in Pennsylvania and at the federal level.
There have been a lot of high-profile incidents involving guns. Is that something that helps your work, or is that just something that's part of what you do?
I think it focuses more attention. These big incidences, even though they seem to be more common and are very troubling and tragic, they should not overshadow the daily toll of gun violence in a city like Philadelphia and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But they do heighten attention and awareness, and so there are educational moments where people learn more about the problems of gun violence, where the guns come from, and possible solutions. So I think they help, and I think Newtown in particular has energized the nation and people in Pennsylvania like other things haven't. The president spoke about that, other leaders have spoken about it, that we seem to be in a very unique moment, and I see that in terms of traffic on our website and on Facebook and the kinds of conversations we see in newspapers across the state, Daily News for sure, Philadelphia Inquirer. People are talking about it more, and I think that it has heightened attention and awareness.
Well, and actually, you were invited down to meet with the vice president with a number of people who are concerned about issues of guns on both sides of the issue. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was about and what that was like?
So earlier this year, when the vice president was tasked with leading this task force and studying about the problem of gun violence, they invited lots of groups down to meet with him. I was in a group of other gun violence prevention advocates, victims' rights advocates, and some gun violence survivors as well, who met with the vice president and also Attorney General Holder to talk about what we saw as possible solutions, what we saw that federal regulations and legislation could fix the biggest problems in our states. It was very exciting. The vice president was very engaged, very interested in hearing how the different states are dealing with things, what the different groups think are priorities. And it wasn't just the big issues that you hear about all the time, about background checks or an assault weapons ban. It was also about things like restoring funding that has been reduced for research by the CDC about the causes of violence and what kinds of things work. It was about restoring funding to ATF and getting a new ATF director. So a really broad-based look. And we knew that the next day, the NRA and big retailers like Walmart of guns were also being invited. So they were talking to people across the spectrum. And then the vice president made a package proposal to the president, who then early in January announced kind of a broad plan, some executive action, some things he was hoping the legislature would take care of. And now we're still in the midst of seeing what's panning out from that. But it was definitely very exciting. It's a special moment to be able to meet with all those advocates and to have the ear in Washington. And I am pleased that they did it so quickly after Newtown. Within a month, they had people coming to Washington to meet and giving suggestions and making proposals.
I think this president, especially when we're talking about children, has a special focus, a special interest. You've talked about how there's a federal push going on, but there also is some push going on in Pennsylvania. And we have a new Attorney General, Kathleen Kane, who's been very involved in looking at the issue of gun violence. Can you tell us a little bit about what she's been doing and about how your agency feels about what she's done so far?
Well, they made this an issue in the Attorney General's race last fall, and the issue of gun violence did come up. And then candidate Kane said this would be important to her. So since she's been in office, she's certainly in the budget hearings recently, she's asked for more money to crack down on traffickers of guns, straw purchasers, to be able to do more prosecutions, which is really important. I think that's something that everybody really agrees on, that if people do violate the laws, they should be prosecuted and have serious consequences. And we know that our district attorney's office here and the Gun Violence Task Force has done a terrific job in partnership with the mayor's office and the state, and they need more funding for that. And other cities should have that same opportunity. She also talked about closing what's been known for a long time as the Florida loophole, which is in Pennsylvania, separate from buying guns. If you would like to be able to carry a weapon concealed on your person, you need a special permit. And that permitting process has always gone through the local sheriff's or local police office. And some people who couldn't pass that process, or who were worried that they couldn't pass it, or actually had permits revoked or denied, were able to go to other states like Florida and apply online, and through a very different process could be granted that permit. So what it meant was that some people in Pennsylvania, some Pennsylvania residents who wouldn't qualify or who actually lost their own permits here, were using out-of-state permits to carry concealed weapons. The Attorney General said during the campaign she was going to look at that, because those are agreements that the Attorney General's office makes with other states. And she did, earlier this year, change the Florida agreement so that now if you are a Pennsylvania full-time resident, you need to get a Pennsylvania license if you want to carry a concealed weapon in this state. You can't rely on the Florida permit. That's a big deal. She said it affected about 4,000 people, so some people say that's not that much. But we believed strongly, and this was supported by law enforcement, that local law enforcement should be making the call about who in their communities are carrying their weapons concealed.
Now, there used to be a much different procedure for somebody who wanted to carry in Philadelphia and somebody who wanted to carry, let's say, out in Potter County, which is much more of a rural area. That was changed by some state law. Can you speak about that?
Well, we still hear that is much harder in Philadelphia. That's a big part of the complaints. People who complain about this change with the Florida law complain about Philadelphia.
So what you're saying is that even though the process in Philadelphia is supposedly the same as it is anywhere else in the state now, the people in Philadelphia who do that process are tougher?
Well, I've never applied, so I can't say that, but I can say that what I've read and heard is that people feel that it is tougher. There's a longer wait period. There might be more scrutiny given to certain kinds of offenses or things in your background that aren't in other counties. And so that has always been a long-standing complaint of people who feel like it's hard to get a concealed carry permit here. But it is supposed to be a law of discretion. It's not the same process as going through a background check to buy a gun. They're looking at other things. They're looking at misdemeanors. They're looking at arrest records. They're sometimes interviewing neighbors and trying to figure out, should this person have the right to carry a concealed weapon?
Okay, so the background check that I would have to go if I went to Walmart to buy a gun, that's a 24-hour background check? Or no, it's an immediate background check?
Instantaneous. It shouldn't take very long at all.
And what pops up that would maybe keep me from being able to buy a gun in a background check?
So we're a point of contact state, which means we have our own Pennsylvania instant criminal background check system, as well as the federal National Instant Criminal Background Check System. So when they run your name through the database, if you've had a serious mental health adjudication, and I mean not going to a psychiatrist because you're depressed, but you've been adjudicated incompetent in a court of law with all the due process procedures that involves, or you've been involuntarily committed, that will show up and will be a hold. If you've had felony arrests, will also show up. You're also supposed to talk about on the form who you're buying the gun for. It's supposed to be for yourself. Have you had problems with drugs or alcohol? Those kinds of things. But so those are the records that get checked. It's not a full check of every time you've ever been arrested or misdemeanor. It's really convictions and then the serious mental health adjudication.
So I can get a gun, but then for me to carry that gun, I've got to go through another check process.
To carry it concealed.
To conceal.
Not have it open carried on your hip or something like that, and to be able to have it in certain places. The concealed carry laws also affect how weapons can be transported in vehicles. And that's a separate process through your local sheriff. Okay,
but I could carry a gun around with me anywhere? Does the law allow that?
Well, it depends. There are certain places where
That's such a good lawyer's answer. It depends.
It depends where you are. There are certain places that don't. We do have gun-free zones in certain schools. Most, often many municipal buildings, courthouses. Some houses of worship won't let you in. But most places, unless there's a separate kind of regulation or law or just a policy in force, you can.
Okay, so the law really is pretty widely open. What I wanted to talk to you about is that I hear there are a lot of federal laws involving guns. That, let's say, if you're a 2-time drug felon and you're picked up with a gun, if the feds want to, there actually is, because you have that gun, even if you're not dealing drugs or using that gun in a crime, just having that gun with a bad background like that puts you into a position where you might be susceptible to a minimum sentence into a couple of decades or more in jail. Are those federal laws helpful in terms of dealing with gun violence? And why don't we hear more about that?
I mean, I think they are, and yes, there are enhancements, but we also know, you know as a lawyer, there are a lot of cases that get plea bargained, different counts get dropped. It depends if people want to get a bigger fish. And so some people end up not getting as serious a penalty for the gun charge, or was the gun actually used? Was it just possessed? And so that is something that people complain about a lot, that judges and prosecutors plea bargain too much or don't give harsher sentences. And that is something we should look at. We need to make sure that our police and prosecutors and judges have the tools to give serious sentences. That's part of what we do with our Court Watch program here in Philadelphia. During sentences, usually for crimes where the gun wasn't actually used, so possession or trafficking, we do bring people in to give a community impact statement if the judge will allow it, because the judges do say when they go through the sentencing, I'm considering the defendant's history and background and the impact on the community. So we actually try to bring community members in to talk about what happens to them and their lives when there's this flow of illegal guns. But we do need to make sure we have strong laws. One of the laws that's being proposed, and it's a bipartisan bill, and actually Representative Meehan is on it, is a stronger penalties for trafficking and straw purchasing, and that's at the federal level. And last year in Pennsylvania, we passed a stronger straw purchaser bill after the murder of Officer Bradley Fox in Montgomery County. So those are very important as well.
Well, and I wanted to actually get into straw purchasing. Can you explain for the audience what a straw purchase is?
So straw purchase is if I go to a gun store with a clean record and I buy a gun, I'm supposed to certify that I'm buying it for myself. If I then leave and give it to you or sell it to you or to somebody who can't have a gun, this happens a lot with girlfriends doing it for boyfriends who might have a record and couldn't get through it, and sometimes we have very egregious cases where a couple will go into a gun shop and the guy will pretty much point out what he wants and she will then buy it, and it's very clear what's happening. And some of our responsible gun shop owners will actually call the police or not do the sale, or will alert them and they take video. But a lot of times people get away with it because to be a straw purchaser, you need a clean record. So if you got caught being a straw purchaser, you could appeal to the mercy of the court. You had a clean record, right? And so there had been a mandatory minimum for a second offense, but there is no second offense for a straw purchaser, because once you've done it and been convicted, you can't buy again. You can't be that straw purchaser.
So when I go in to try to be a straw purchaser, they're not going to deny me because I've been a straw purchaser.
Right. So what the new law that the Senate passed late last year in Pennsylvania, and then the governor signed right at the close of the session after the murder of the police officer, was if you do it multiple times and you're being tried for them all at the same time, which that gentleman who had bought the gun for the killer had done. He had bought him 9 guns. You could have a mandatory minimum for that. So it's not like the first time and then 6 years later, but if at the same time you're being tried for multiple offenses and purchases, you can get a mandatory minimum. And that's, again, another tool. It's a stronger penalty. It should make somebody think twice about doing it. And it also is now there's some incentive for people to flip on the person they're actually buying the guns for, because they're not just facing probation or a slap on the wrist because they had a clean record. They could be facing a mandatory 5-year sentence.
So it does sound like a lot is happening. How much of this that's happening is because of the advocacy of groups like yours? You mentioned that you guys have a court watching program. Can you talk about that?
Well, we do bring people from across Philadelphia, and we are hoping to extend it to other counties. And this is a partnership with the District Attorney's Office and the Gun Violence Task Force. And we bring them into sentencing to be there to watch the sentencing, and if the judge will allow, to make a brief community impact statement. Some judges do allow it because it's part of the sentencing calculus. Some don't because they're not direct victims or directly affected. We try and make the case that it does terrorize the neighborhood. People can't have their kids or their grandkids outside, and that illegal guns being brought in are worthy of serious consequences. When people get probation or a slap on the wrist or house arrest for having an illegal gun, it's not a big deterrent, and we want people to be deterred from this, and we want there to be serious consequences for bringing illegal guns in.
This was the same strategy, actually, that Mothers Against Drunk Driving did a generation ago to get the drunk driving laws that were on the books actually enforced.
Right.
So you're not asking judges to do something that isn't in the law. You're asking judges to do what they're asked to do by the law.
Right. Judges have discretion within the guidelines, and we try and give them evidence so that it's not just the defendant family there saying, give us mercy. It's somebody else saying, look, I'm affected by this. This hurts me. This hurts Philadelphia. Please consider that in your calculus, which, if you listen to the judges read their sentencing, they always have that litany of things that they consider, and it's community impact. So what this tries to do is actually give evidence that the judge can weigh. But I think it has tremendous impact, not just on what happens in the courtroom, but it's very empowering for members of the community to be able to come and say in court, I want to take a stand against gun violence. I want to be safe in my neighborhood. I want to be able to walk to the corner store. I want to be able to have my grandchildren here. And so we try and do that, to try and empower them that way. And I think that the educational efforts that we do and the training that we do and trying to teach people to be advocates both in the courtroom and in their communities and to their representatives is very important.
Now, so you have your court watching program, you have your education and your advocacy programs. What else do you guys do? And when I say you guys, how big is Ceasefire PA? I know you're the executive director, but do you have 100 people working for you? Or?
No, I wish we did. We have a small staff. We have somebody in Pittsburgh, and we are starting a second program in Pittsburgh. We had a special grant called Where Did the Gun Come From?, which focuses on getting the story out about the sources of illegal guns, so that when people do report in the media and from the police about crimes, that they also tell the story of the gun. Was it stolen?
And we have that in our local papers here. Occasionally they will tell the story of where a gun was used in a crime and how that gun came back. Is that through your efforts?
Somewhat, but we really want to focus that more throughout the state. We think that's a really important educative tool. And again, it is kind of like the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Some of this is changing culture, and these things do take time. Remember years and years ago, car accidents, people didn't say, well, you're wearing a seatbelt. Now, everybody says that. So some of that is changing that. Where did the gun come from? Where did they get that? Did it come from around the corner? Was it stolen? Was it a straw purchase? So I have a small staff here in Philadelphia, and then we rely on volunteers who help us organize and invite us into the communities to talk about it. And there are people all over this Commonwealth who want to do something about it, and we partner with them. We go to churches and synagogues and community groups and schools and really talk to people about the problems in their communities and how we can empower them to make change both at the local level, the state level, and now the national level. And we work together, and we do have growing list of people who receive our emails and join in conversations on our website and invite us to be with part of their community, and we're hoping that will continue to grow. But we are always looking for volunteers and students who want to work with us, and like any nonprofit, that's how we get the work done.
Well, and it's interesting. I have a number of people that I work with who have concealed carry permits, but who tell me that they've worked with Ceasefire PA. So obviously you don't have a litmus test that you can't be involved in guns. But the serious question is, how do you reach across, if we're changing the culture and we do have people who feel any mention of anything about guns, whether legal or illegal, is an attack on their fundamental rights, how do you reach across the aisle in a way to make a difference?
That's hard. I think the easier part is the law-abiding gun owners that you're talking about, who know that they would never tolerate somebody trying to get a gun without a background check, or of course they would report if their gun was lost or stolen, and they secure their guns, and they think everybody should. So they're easy people to work with. We agree on most things, and we welcome them. They are some of our greatest supporters and best validators for what we try to do. As far as the others, I've met a lot of people in the last couple months. I think mostly, for the most part, good people. We have a fundamental disagreement about certain things, but we try and find common ground on the things that we can work on and start there. We don't have to agree on everything, but that's how you get things done in Harrisburg and Washington. You try and find that common ground because you can't do it alone. So we do try and be always very reasonable and calm. I always try and talk about respecting the Second Amendment, but believing, as Heller said, that there could be reasonable regulation, and then starting with that premise. So where is that reasonable regulation? Where can we find that common ground? Because that's how you make change.
I wanted to keep focusing a little bit on Philadelphia now for the last part of our talk, because Philadelphia oftentimes is pointed to as sort of the problem child for guns. When I travel the state, I hear from a lot of people that say, you guys just have your own little problems, and it's somehow something unique to Philadelphia. Are there special factors about Philadelphia that make us to be more concerned about gun violence?
Only because we're a bigger city with more people and more crimes, kind of per capita. But, of the more than 1,300 gun deaths in Pennsylvania last year, so we had 300 homicides in Philadelphia. That's still a lot else throughout the state. Pittsburgh has a problem, but it's not just the big cities. Erie, York, Reading, Bethlehem, they all have problems. Nobody's immune anymore. So yes, Philadelphia has its problems, but we also have terrific police force. Our police chief our police commissioner is very involved in solving the problem, both locally and at the national level. He's had a tremendous role at the national level. Our mayor is leading the conference of mayors and has been very involved. So Philadelphia has wanted and sought, like other communities, tools that the state hasn't provided, trying to enact some of its own laws, trying to have harsher penalties for carrying illegally in Philadelphia, but they can't do it alone. So they need the state to approve that.
And Pennsylvania actually has laws that means that Philadelphia can't do more than the rest of the state does, right, when it comes to guns?
There is in the Uniform Firearms Act a preemption that talks about that only the state can regulate the lawful use, possession, or transfer of firearms. Now, there have been some test cases, and in some of them there hasn't been standing, and in some of them it has been found that Philadelphia or other cities overreached. But there's also the issue that what is the lawful use? Some communities think that some of the things they've done, like requiring lost or stolen reporting of handguns, actually refers to unlawful use at that point. That hasn't been tested yet because nobody's actually had standing to challenge it, and that has been an ongoing fight in Harrisburg, the NRA trying to get standing for itself or its members to challenge communities' laws, and communities saying to Harrisburg, well, if you won't let us do it on our own, do it for us. And that, I think, is something that we'll be seeing in the coming months and year, communities who want to take action and asking their legislature to do it for them.
A final topic to talk about, because so often we talk about gun violence and we talk about criminal acts and we look at homicide and things like that. But a major concern is the success rate for suicides when guns are available. And given our laws and given the fact that a person who might be depressed and contemplating suicide may certainly pass a background check, is there anything that we can do with that? What are the ways that we can try to help if we're watching this and we're concerned about family members who might have access to guns and things like that? Is there anything that we can do?
Well, it's a very good point. There are more suicides than homicides every year. And we do know that suicide by gun is much more effective than other attempts. And we also know that somebody who doesn't always succeed in an attempt doesn't necessarily try the second time. But if they've been successful because they had a gun, then that's why
there
the
isn't
rate
a
goes
second
up.
chance,
There's
right?
not a second chance. So what can you do? One is if you are living with somebody who is depressed or not somebody who's been mentally adjudicated and competent, but somebody who's having trouble and there are guns in the home, either secure them or get rid of them. I have talked to psychologists and psychiatrists who work with kids who tell parents, get your guns out of the house. And people wait, and then finally they do it and they say, thank God that wasn't my kid who did that. If you know somebody who has guns and is in that kind of situation, try and get them away. What we don't have that some other states have is a kind of an interim process short of mental adjudication where a doctor can go to the police and try and get a 30-day hold. Somebody can't buy weapons or you can take them away for 30 days. There is, of course, appeal processes, so somebody, you can't take away their rights kind of willy-nilly, but that kind of emergency procedure. Some states are looking at that more seriously. We don't have that yet. We do the full adjudication with rights and restoration of rights and all of that, but that is something to think about. And I think, again, that's an area where there might be common ground, where people think as long as there can be a restoration of rights, because there should be. If you are no longer under a mental disability, you should be able to have your rights restored. I think that's somewhere we could have common ground, because people do realize that there are people who, there are moments when that combination with easy access to weapons can obviously be lethal.
Well, Shira, it is certainly a complicated and difficult issue, but thank you so much for the work that you're doing. That's the end of the time that we have for today. And I do want to thank you, my guest Shira Goodman, the Executive Director of Ceasefire PA, for joining us. And I want to thank all of you for watching. You've been watching the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society's Perspective series on CCP TV, the educational channel of the Community College of Philadelphia. I'm David Travaskis, Adjunct Professor in the Paralegal Studies program. For more information, please contact us at the Community College, and we'll see you next time on CCP TV.